Oh, I'm supposed to speak in English. It's such a luxury for me to get to speak in English. And nobody gets to make fun of my gringo accent, which my colleagues like to do. Thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed this half hour to eat and talk to your colleagues. On behalf of WOLA, CELS, and the ACLU, I'd like to welcome you to this event on the impact of drug policy on human rights in the Americas. 1 year ago, the OAS's Inter-American Commission on Human Rights held its first ever hearing on the impact of drug policies on human rights across the Americas. Yesterday, the Commission held a hearing on drug policy and human rights in Mexico, and several of our colleagues here participated in that hearing. I was very struck by Commissioner Paulo Vanucci from Brazil, who gave this rousing intervention on the need to end the drug war mentality and focus on promoting strategies of peace with a focus on the well-being of individuals. Commissioner Tracy Robinson also highlighted the need to pay more attention to the impact of the drug war or drug policies on women. And so I came away from that afternoon yesterday feeling like this is a very propitious time to be engaging both the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and also CICAD, and I would like to welcome our two CICAD colleagues here, the OAS's drug agency. It's a really propitious time to be engaging them on issues related to human rights and drug policy. And towards that end, CELS turned the testimony that we presented last year. There were 17 organizations involved in that effort, right? 17?
Yes.
Yeah. And turned it into this really awesome report. There are copies out here, and we have more if we run out, but just beautifully done on the issue. So I encourage all of you to take a look at it. So all of the people who will be speaking here today represent organizations that were involved in our testimony last year. And before I present them, I'd like to say just one word about, oh, it's not there anymore. Well, there was there a picture of Bogota, Colombia, and visited the Buen Pastor Women's Prison. And Adam had up here, and I assume we'll see it later, the picture of an Afro-Colombian woman incarcerated in Bogota. Very moving picture. You can just see a tear coming out of her eye. But anyway, getting back to the presentations today. Luciana Pol will speak first. She is a sociologist with a degree from the University of Buenos Aires. Since 2003, she's worked at CELS, the Center for Legal and Social Studies in Buenos Aires. She began as a researcher in the Security Policy and Institutional Violence program, where she wrote various studies and conducted advocacy on issues of security policies, prisons, drug policy, social protests, political violence, and the use of force. Between 2011 and 2014, she coordinated the program for security policy and institutional violence at CELS. And today she works exclusively on international work in political security and human rights, also for CELS. Unfortunately, Daniela Quintana, who was also going to be with us today, is late. We're hoping she'll be able to make it, but she had a very positive turn in events in a case presented before the Inter-American Commission where the government has agreed to a friendly settlement. So she's presently in negotiations with the Chilean government. I will introduce her if she comes, and we'll give her a chance to speak later. Amaya is a researcher in human rights and drug policy at the Mexican Commission for the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights. She's also a member of Reverdecer Colectivo, a youth organization that strives to change drug policy in Mexico and end the war on drugs by working from a harm reduction perspective and a global south perspective. Omaya Ordorica. This is where my bad Spanish comes in. Ordorica was also present at the commission hearing yesterday on Mexico and human rights. And Jessalyn McCurdy from the ACLU is a senior legislative counsel in the Washington Legislative Office of the ACLU. As a senior legislative counsel, she covers various criminal justice issues, including federal sentencing, prison reform, drug policy, and capital punishment. Jessalyn was a member of the ACLU WLO, the Washington office, before joining the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary's Committee as counsel. You were counsel at the Judiciary Committee before you joined the ACLU.
Actually, between. I've done 2 steps.
Okay, that's why this is confusing. Okay.
Exactly.
And was the lead House counsel for the historic Fair Sentencing Act of 2010. And we're thrilled that, for those of you following this issue, you know this is a very busy time in Washington for people working on criminal justice reform. And we're very happy that Jessalyn could be here and that the ACLU could sponsor this event with us. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the speakers, and I'm going to everybody will speak for 10 minutes, and I will be strict with the time as you have been forewarned. So, Luciana.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thanks, Walla, for the kind invitation. For us, it's really a pleasure to be here. It's really a pleasure because it means to have come a long way. As Coletta says, I'm presenting today the report made by these 17 organizations from 11 different countries. To start with, there's the question of why this human rights organization. Most of us are human rights organizations that do not have a focus on drug policy. We did not concentrate in this issue. Of course, we were aware for decades of a problem that it's concerning the individual freedoms and the privacy that is involved in the prohibition of consumption, of course, as the debate is many times so historically was shaped mainly in Europe or in North America maybe as well. But why with the time, what with the decades, why in the last, especially in the last 10 years, why human rights organizations we are talking about drug policy? So that was a really long way to go. And telling the story of this report is a little of telling the story of how this problem was built as a human rights concern for all of us. One of the things that caught our attention is for all of us in our field work in different areas. Organizations like mine, CELS, have been working for decades in criminal justice, in conditions of detention in the prisons, in security policies, in violence. And we have for years did not perceive any relations of any of these areas of work with the drug policy. But a few, I think it was in 2009, there was a group of former presidents and relevant personalities in Latin America that really caught the attention of the world, pointing out this as a problem with this commission that was called Latin American Commission on Drug and Democracy. So they were calling the attention on the militarization of the responses of the state toward the drug trafficking. And soon enough, the magnitude of the problem led a broad community to focus the attention of that. In the case of my organization, CELS, we were conducting in 2007 a research on violence within women prisons, and they are visiting all of the federal prisons in my country, in Argentina. We started to realize the magnitude of the problem of the incarceration of women. One of the things that we will talk today, and Amasha will do an interesting focus on that, relating with the situation of Mexico, is related with the militarization of the responses of the states toward drug policy. The military efforts have historically concentrated in eliminating the production, especially of organic drugs. And therefore, the violence has been located not so much in the centers of consumption, but rather in the centers of production and transit of organic drugs. And there's this first thing to point out, maybe, is that certain disbalances of the different responses towards different markets. So we don't encounter so many militarized efforts that have so many so deep consequences in the production and circulation of synthetic drugs as we find in the cultivation and especially in the cultivating areas of Latin America that are related with the production of organic drugs.
Is that working?
Oh, I don't. A ver. Okay, that was supposed to be before. So in the areas of production and transit, which are located in very extremely poor areas of developing countries, especially in the Andean countries, the living condition of populations with very few resources already would deteriorate even further with the militarization, displacement, and fumigations plans are implemented. The level of violence of some of the forced eradication programs has been for decades been responsible of the injuries and even assassination of many cultivators. And in most of the areas, not in all of them, but in most of the areas, there are small farmers or peasants who are the first producers of the coca leaf. At the same time, there are efforts to reduce the demands of drugs across the world following the drug conventions, especially the strong focus of the Third Drug Convention in 1988. Even the private and personal act of consumption has been considered a crime. In many cases, the detention and incarceration of thousands and thousands of individual consumers has helped to hide the fact that we have not succeeded in chasing the big players of the game. This is, of course, now being under a huge amount of debate internationally. And there are many UN agencies that have already identified this particular feature of the international drug control system as one of the barriers to the access of health. That is the case of UNAIDS, that is the case of the last report released last month from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva that also identifies this prohibition of consumption, the criminalization of consumption as one of the barriers to the access of health for the people who needs it, which are certainly not all the consumers. Paradoxically, in all our countries, especially in Latin America, this fear that the drug consumption produces in our society has not been addressed with information available on drugs, on drug consumption, and so as to reduce the damages that drugs may produce, or with the multiplication of health responses. So on the contrary, and this is the disbalance we have in our countries, all this military effort has not a balanced counterpart in the health responses that the state gave to the people who needs it. And even it is very difficult for many of the people who seek help to find real health rights-based responses to the consumption. Okay. Our fear to drugs has been fed mainly by detentions and more severe sanctions. That is another thing that we find in the report, and there are, of course, this great background paper that has been produced by the Justicias highlighting the inflation in the sanctions for drug offenses. maybe Cheselyn will talk a little about that, but we can say that in the US, the situation is one of the most prominent examples of the levels of incarceration that we can reach with the prosecution of consumer and small dealers. Only between 2001 and 2010 in the US, 8 million of people has been detained only for crimes related with marijuana, not taking into account the other illegal drugs. The crime of the majority of them, 88% of them, were detained for the crime of possession. So the impact of these policies in the world prison system has been acknowledged for many organizations. The last report on Penal Reform International, another organization that do not have a focus on drug, has a dossier analyzing the big impact in the prisons all over the world of the drug-related crimes. And they also identified this tendency of the big majority, the substantive majority of them being related with small offenses. In our region, the disproportionality of the sentence is so high that in some countries we have bigger punishment for drug offenses than for rape or for assassination. However, and this is the last thing I say, in our region, there are also new ways, a new approach to drug policy to look at. So the experiences that are being in some countries with regulation of the markets, the experiences of the agreements made with the cocaleros to reduce the surface of plantation, the decriminalization of consumption in some of the countries are also examples to look at. I think Latin America has been playing a major role in this debate, pushing forward this debate, because of the terrible consequences that some of our countries in some areas we have experimented. But also from the crisis, maybe there are the new approaches and the new responses are being seen. So we expect the region to continue being a big player on this, but we cannot deny the global dimension of the drug policy, of the drug market. So we need the involvement also of the countries that are mainly receptors of the drugs or consumption of the drugs, that is the case of Europe and the US, to get involved also in this debate. There are many things happening globally and regionally, and I'm sure that Latin America and the human rights community will continue push, but this is a bigger problem that involves us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luciana. We were almost on time. Close. We'll turn it over now to Amaya.
If you invite Latin Americans, you know what happens.
Hi, thank you, Wola, for this space. Well, as Luciana was saying, drug policies based on a prohibitionist approach result in the creation of illegal markets that regulate themselves through violence, and this are related to increase in arms trafficking, territorial disputes, corruption, and the weakening of democratic institutions. And as a response to this, in many countries, states have used this as a perfect excuse to apply heavy-handed security strategies, and in Latin America, most of these have been militarized security strategies. Just to name a few, in Peru, military actions have been put in place in order to eradicate production and illicit trafficking, which has obviously been unsuccessful. But since it's a territory ruled by illegal drug trafficking and terrorism, this is what the state has defined about the southern part of the region of Peru. It's over-militarized with over 1,700 officials distributed among 40 military bases. There is a lack of rule of law due to the violence generated by the combination of drug traffickers, armed groups, and military occupation. And this has led to a decreed state by emergency by the government, which has led to forced retention of the population, the presence of foreign police and military, coordinated military and police actions, and numerous detentions of peasants and community leaders, as well as constant harassment of the population. Honduras is another country that has opted for military solutions. In 2009, a militarization process was set in motion, which included giving more power to the armed forces by allowing them to carry out police functions. And since 2010, Honduras has maintained a minimum of 4,000 soldiers on the streets. And in 2013, the Congress approved the creation of a military police force of 1,000 members, which has total independence by its judges and prosecutors. In Brazil, pacifying police units were created in order to contain drug trafficking and organized crime. These units have been presented as a human rights approach to security, and they have a very created human rights discourse, but in practice what they do is they actually invade and take over communities and neighborhoods, and they discipline, control, and employ violence selectively in these occupied territories. In 2013, there was in one neighborhood a special, very emblematic violence that where police forces executed 10 members of one community, and during the next year, this same community was occupied by 2,430 soldiers, and during this time, 20 people were killed as a consequence of military actions. I'm going to extend a little bit about Mexico because that's where I'm from, but I also brought booklets from our organization about the grave, serious human rights violations in Mexico in the context of the war on drugs. It's in Spanish and in English, so if you flip sides, you get both. We have also one about the situation of human rights defenders in the context of the war on drugs in Mexico, also in Spanish and in English. And there are small cards with the faces of human rights defenders in Mexico as a part of a campaign that we have right now to visibilize human rights defenders that are at risk in our country. So please feel free to grab any of that information. And there's a couple more that are only in Spanish with other subjects, but if you want to, they're right over there. In Mexico in 2006, the former president declared a frontal war against drug trafficking in Mexico, which is the Mexican contribution to the global war on drugs. And it included the deployment of thousands of military troops along the country and the replacement of military heads of civil public institutions for security were replaced with military, both active and retired military. And despite the change in government in 2012, there have been no substantive changes in the strategy. And the military and the armed forces keep being extended, their functions keep being extended, and now they have been included not only in security strategies, but in public health strategies, as they have now been included in prevention campaigns, which should correspond to a public health institution. The central role assigned to the armed forces in the war against drugs in Mexico superimposes the premises of national security over the observance of human rights. According to the report of the mission to Mexico by the Special Rapporteur on Torture, the deployment of armed forces reached 50,000 troops in 2012. And according to the same report, more than 32,000 soldiers are still carrying out tasks that correspond to civil corporations. This, coupled with the creation of a gendarmerie with military training, is a clear demonstration that the militarized security strategy continues. The scale of these interventions has been so high that between 2006 and 2012, soldiers detained over 51,000 civilians during the administration, and during the beginning of this next administration, which is from 2012 to the beginning of this year, military detained 12,840 civilians. And the Navy has detained between 2006 and 2014 over 2,054 civilians. They have also participated in over 1,700 joint operations between the military and the police in just the last 2 years. Since the implementation of the security strategy, extrajudicial killings by the armed forces have increased. The Ministry of National Defense reports over 3,500 armed confrontations with civilians in which alleged members of organized crime were killed. almost 4,000 alleged members of organized crime were killed, 60,000 innocent bystanders, and 2,009 military elements died. The Mexican Navy reports 109 confrontations between 2012 and 2014, in which 2,096 Navy officials and 14 civilians were killed, plus 111 people were arrested. The participation of the armed forces have also been registered in enforced disappearances. Of the 11 recommendations by the National Human Rights Commission on forced disappearance issued between 2006 and 2014, 7 recognized the armed forces as a responsible authority. And of the 140 recommendations made against security forces for torture during the same period of time, 139 pointed to the armed forces as the responsible authorities as well. This has allowed us to infer as an organization that in Mexico, murder and forced disappearance and torture are part of the strategy for combating illicit drug trafficking. And since there has been a discourse change, now we call it Achieving a Mexico in Peace. This situation of violence and militarization in the context of the war on drugs has deeply affected the human rights situation in our region, which is why we consider it should be a priority for the Inter-American Commission right now. And we applaud that there has been a growing interest. As Coleta mentioned, just yesterday there was a hearing which we consider as a result of the hearing that led to this report. It has opened spaces for a human rights perspective approach to the war on drugs. Yet during this hearing, we had the chance to discuss how the human rights violations in the context of the war on drugs in Mexico possibly constitute crimes against humanity, and also how they affect particular populations such as youth, women, people who use drugs, people who are incarcerated, and people who live on the streets. But with the chance to focus specifically on the subject in Mexico. The commission was really receptive to the public spaces. They alleged that of the 26,000, more than 26,000 that are currently registered as disappeared in our country were just people who migrated and who forgot to let their families know that they had changed their address. So we basically have a problem of stupidity in our country instead of disappearances. But this is a moment where we have more places to have this conversation, to put this information forth. Still, the Inter-American Commission does have a pending task in the resolution, promotion and protection of human rights in the search for new approaches and effective solutions in the development and implementation of policies to address the global drug problem in the Americas, which was adopted at the 44th General Assembly of the Organization of American States. It requests these mentioned bodies to convene a meeting of experts to exchange national experiences and best practices. The time that the resolution sets for this meeting to have happened has already gone by. So we hope that this new interest by the Inter-American Commission will result and will soon translate into this meeting being fulfilled, and there actually being an official evaluation by the Inter-American Commission of the effects the war on drugs has had on human rights.
Thank you. That was exactly 10 minutes. So we're going to turn now to Jesselyn. ACLU provided the information in this report on mass incarceration in the United States. Obviously, a lot has happened since this report was we first started working on this, so we've asked Jesselyn to not only talk about the issue of mass incarceration, but in addition to address what's going on now in terms of the reforms we are starting to see in the United States in terms of the criminal justice system and drug policy.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank the Washington Office of Latin America for inviting me, as well as the Center for Legal and Social Studies for inviting me to speak today. It is a really busy time in Washington now, but I'm glad to be here with you, particularly in a group of people who recognize that the war on drugs has been a utter failure in both America and Latin America as well. And it's great to have this space to have a conversation about kind of what is going on in the Americas. So the ACLU, for almost 100 years now, we're about to celebrate our 100th anniversary in 2020 has been on the forefront of working to defend and preserve individuals' constitutional rights and liberties. Part of that work has, for many years, been focused on the criminal justice system, and particularly reforming the criminal justice system, and more recently focused on this mass incarceration in this country. What has happened in the past few years is we have recognized that this nation has become addicted to incarceration. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that in a way that I mean to minimize people who have addictions to drugs or alcohol or other things. I say that because some of the results of this country's addiction to incarceration are the same as the results to addiction to drugs, addiction to alcohol, addiction to other vices. It often leads to devastating consequences on families and children. It often leads to death in some situations. And so I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that to minimize addiction, but I say that just to make the point of how serious this incarceration problem, this mass incarceration problem is in this country. Part of the problem is that we often in America, in the United States, I should say, use incarceration as the first response to any problem we have in this country. You have a child that's in schools and is misbehaving, lock them up. You have someone that's smoking outside of a restaurant, lock them up. It has become our first response, our gut response to every problem in this country. And what we have found and what we have seen is it has led to a mass incarceration problem. And that problem was really crystallized in 2008 when the Pew Charitable Trust came out with their report, 1 in 100. And that report basically outlines how in this country we have now incarcerated on any given day 2.3 million people in our prisons and jails across the country, both at the state and federal level. And that equals 1 in every 100 adults in this country is on any given day is in prison or in jail. And I think that report and those numbers and the way that was framed, the results from that research was framed, really crystallized it for people. Because I think one of the problems with the mass incarceration problem itself is it's so amorphous, it's so big, you can't wrap your hands around it, that the public couldn't take it seriously or couldn't understand it or couldn't understand the level of seriousness in it. So when Pew came out with this report and really kind of crystallized it and put it in concrete terms, I think it really got people's attention, both criminal justice reform advocates and just the public in general, that we have a problem. We have 5% of the population, the world population in this country, but we incarcerate at least 25% of people in this country. And that makes it real for people. Also in 2010, Michelle Alexander published a book called The New Jim Crow, A Colorblindness in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And what Michelle put together in a very brilliant way is an argument that says that we have now replaced a pre-civil rights Jim Crow discriminatory system with the government-sponsored war on drugs and mass incarceration in this country. So we no longer have a segregated system in the South where we keep people of color down and we violate their rights and liberties. We now call it the war on drugs and mass incarceration. And I think one of the most poignant points from Michelle Alexander's book that makes this point is that she talks about how in America today, Black people are incarcerated at a higher rate than Black people were at the height of apartheid in South Africa. I mean, I think that says it all. I mean, we're talking about 2015. We're in 2015, and Black people are incarcerated at a higher rate than Black people were incarcerated at the height of apartheid in South Africa. So in response to this growing recognition that there is a mass incarceration problem in this country, the ACLU has launched a campaign that we call the Smart Justice Campaign. And the Smart Justice Campaign particularly was launched in response to the fact that mass incarceration in this country has such a devastating impact on Black and brown people that there needs to be some organized effort to address it. And so we are trying to do that through this campaign, that the campaign's goal is to try to reduce mass incarceration by 50% in this country over the long term. We recognize that it's an audacious goal, we recognize that it's a big goal, but it's a necessary goal, because if we just nibble around the edges of this problem of mass incarceration, we're never going to get to a point where we resolve it. So we're trying to think big, we're trying to think bold, and we're trying to do it at a level, both on the state level and the federal level, that we can have a significant reduction in mass incarceration. And we're doing that through state ballot initiatives, through state campaigns to change legislation, and currently we're in the midst of a federal campaign to change sentencing and prison related legislation here in Washington, D.C. And that campaign here in D.C. has really grown out of the work on the state level that has happened over the past 10 years, because what we've seen is many states have, in recognition of the fact that they cannot afford to continue to incarcerate people at the rate that they are incarcerating people, have changed their laws so that less people are coming into the criminal justice system. Now, the changes may not be, again, making a huge dent into mass incarceration, but the symbolism and the willingness to look at this problem of mass incarceration on the state level has really led to where we are today on the federal level. And so it's been a situation where there have been changes on the state level, and federal legislators here in Washington have become comfortable with the concept of reforming the criminal justice system, and so now are willing to look at it in the context of the federal system. And so that's what we are legislate. We have groups on both sides of the political spectrum that have come together to call on Congress to change sentencing laws so that we can address this over-incarceration in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and that's the Bureau of Prisons for federal crimes. And so conservatives and liberals have come together to make these calls on Congress, and what we've seen is that after months of negotiations, Republicans and Democrats have come together to introduce a bill that would be a first step toward reducing incarceration on the federal level, but much, much more needs to be done. It's not the perfect bill. It is clearly a compromise. It's focused on nonviolent, and particularly nonviolent drug offenders, but there are significant aspects of the bill that would result in many people coming home from federal prison. Some of the provisions in the bill are actually retroactive, so they would apply to people who are currently in prison. But most of those people would have to go before a judge, would have to file a motion before a judge, and then the judge would make a decision as to whether or not they've served enough served enough of their sentence to come home. The bill would also address, for example, this issue, which is doesn't affect a lot of people on the federal level, but it's important, again, symbolically, around juvenile life without parole. So in many states across the country, we have young people who committed crimes when they were under 18 who are serving life without parole sentences. We have some people, probably not more than 35 or so people in the federal system who are in those same circumstances. This particular bill would allow for those people who are not so young anymore, but allow for them to go before a judge and after 20 years have their sentence reduced. This bill would also ban essentially juvenile solitary confinement. It would also allow for early release of people who are over 60 years old and serving long sentences, and who would also reduce, this bill would also reduce the drug felony life without parole. So in the federal system, we have a statute that if you have 3 prior convictions and you get another drug conviction, you're potentially exposed to a life without parole sentence. And the ACLU back a few years ago did a report without parole sentence for consideration by, hopefully will be voted out of, has introduced to the bill that was General Eric Holder, who has came out a few years ago with what he called the Smart on Crime initiative that rethought how prosecutors charged people in drug cases. We've had the United States Sentencing Commission, which oversees the length of sentences in this country, come out and make reductions to sentencing guidelines and apply them retroactively, so people who are currently serving time in prison could benefit from changes, and many of them have been and will be released soon. And so Congress is really is really behind the ball on this issue, and so we're very hopeful that we can get to the finish line in terms of reform. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's very significant, particularly for those of you in the room from Latin America, that we are now seeing the country that exported its drug laws to Latin America, and many of the things that Luciana and Amaya talked about have to do with the fact that those drug laws were exported and adopted across the region, and now we're seeing this fundamental shift in the United States in terms of criminal justice, and for the first time, serious efforts at criminal justice reform. And I just really want to applaud the ACLU and Jocelyn for all you guys have done to make that happen. I'm going to open it up for questions and comments now. Before doing that, I'd like to introduce one other person in the room who was very involved in the production of this, the testimony and the report, which Sergio Chaparro, who is with De Justicia, one of the organizations we collaborate very closely with on a variety of projects. Sergio is an economist and philosopher with a law degree from the National University of Colombia, and he is presently the principal investigator at De Justicia, working on drug policy and social rights, and provides support to other areas of De Justicia's work. And he and I are both members of the Colectivo de Estudios Drogas y Derecho, a research consortium that looks at drug laws and rights issues, and also works with us on the Women, Drug Policy, and Incarceration project, as many people in the room do. In fact, Sergio, I'm going to open it up for a few questions, but Daniela hasn't arrived, so perhaps in a few minutes you could say a little more about the issue of the impact of drug policy on women, which we haven't addressed here. But first I will open it up to give Sergio a chance to, sit up here, to think about that. And see if anyone has any comments or questions, and would just ask you to identify yourself before doing that. I'll give that to Sergio. Yes, sir?
Hi, Juan Cartagena. I head up an organization, civil rights organization here in the United States called Latino Justice Club. Besides the efforts in Uruguay regarding marijuana, both decriminalization of production, in Latin America, have there been any other efforts to either decriminalize some drugs and or consider production? I'm talking about from the official point of view of the nation state.
Luciana?
I think there are a few initiatives that are worth considering. Of course, the regulation of the market in Uruguay is the most innovative one. But also there are some state policies, for instance, the policy that, well, Coleta is an expert on that, the policy of agreement with the cocalero, way that the products are not enforced. Of the criminalization of consumption. In Argentina, that has happened also at the level of the Supreme Court, that has considered against the constitutional principle of the privacy of the acts, the consumption of drugs. So it has not yet been translated into a new drug law, but there's a ruling of the Supreme Court that is in force. Similar ruling occurred in Colombia many years ago, I think in the 94, I think? 1992? I think in the Ministry of Justice of Colombia there are many interesting developments on how to change the approach, the criminal approach to drug offenses. There are several debates about medical use of marijuana in Chile, in Paraguay. So there are, in most of our countries, there are being debates that has led to new policies or not. But there are some of them that are already in force, and in the case of Bolivia, for instance, giving very interesting results.
Thank you. I think we should just add, in light of the recent election that has said it will seek to also create legal regulated cannabis markets. And it's also worth mentioning Jamaica, which...
And Costa Rica.
Yeah.
I forgot those two, yes.
Yeah.
And Mexico, they just announced this week that the Supreme Court will be discussing the legality of a cultivation club and also the legality of medical marijuana in the specific case of an 8-year-old who just imported last week medical marijuana for an epilepsy treatment.
Sorry. We need a mic for Sergio, though. No, it doesn't.
¿Quieres venir acá?
Okay. Sorry, I guess I'm supposed to ask each of you to speak into the mic.
Oh,
So,
sorry.
Sergio, we will turn it over to you. I will help with any translating needs, and then we'll turn it back to the audience.
Okay.
But his English is really good, so we'll start in English.
No, not so good, but I will try to speak in English. I just want to add that most all the problems that we have seen in the other Latin American countries and also in the United States, also we have all that problems in Colombia, most of them, and even more of that problems. Just some data about it. While than 35%, the people incarcerated for drug offenses has increased in 269%. We have spent more than 1,184 millions of dollars to keep all those people incarcerated. Women are over represented in the women incarcerated by drug offenses are overrepresented in the incarcerated female people in Colombia. 45% of the women are incarcerated for drug offenses, and I think that all this work that civil society has been making to let the world recognize that the answers that we were trying to apply to deal with the drug problems, let us recognize that we have designed stupid ways to try this problem, because I think that there is no other word to methods that to protect health, for example, cause a huge damage to the health of the population, like the aerial spreading with glyphosate in Colombia, or for example the mass incarceration that really destroys family and affect the life of the kids, in the name of protect the health of the kids and the health of the people. So I think that all these efforts, I hope that all these efforts could let us recognize that we are in an age that in which the humanity is designing wrong, stupid methods to fight with a problem that if you achieve if you deal with a human rights perspective or a public health perspective, could be led us to design better policies to deal with this problem. So I think that.
Thank you very much, Sergio. I'd like to turn it back to the audience now. Does anyone else have a question, comment? Yes, sir?
Franco Bastida, fellow at the Center for International Policy. I have two quick questions. The first one was, I really enjoyed the comments on criminal justice reform, and my question is, seeing the strides that are being made towards whether it's a national drug strategy, the Obama administration, how can that be complemented, seeing that the United States is still one of the biggest funders through the Department of Defense and State Department in Peru, Colombia, Mexico for capital cards? And the second question was for Mexico, because I'm from Mexico. We see it not just with drug rights, whether it's financial, economic rights, or migrant rights. The Mexican government has really conflicting discourses on what it says it does and what it actually does. What are the alternatives that citizens have to actually make the government realize that, because sometimes it seems that pressure by civil society is not enough, or that change cannot take place. So what are some things that could enable citizens to present realistic alternatives that the government could actually not disregard with its discourse? That's a little bit tough.
I think the first one's tough too, actually.
Do you want to?
I'll take it.
Please use the
Oh,
microphone.
yes.
Yeah.
So you make a great point because, again, this has been a difficult road to even get the attention of the lawmakers here in Washington that deal with the Judiciary Committee, so those that deal with kind of the laws around the justice system, the judges, and prisons. So now you're talking about a parallel strategy that we really need to start thinking about in the context of working with legislators, civil society, to focus on the Department of Defense, their policies, their operation, and other agencies within the government, and the president and the Office of National Drug Control Policy, to get them to, because that has been a more difficult step for us in terms of not so much the president. The president has been on board with domestic criminal justice reform. He's very much on board with it. In fact, he's in the midst of what he's calling a criminal justice tour this week. He's in West Virginia today. He's meeting with law enforcement officers tomorrow. He, as you may or may not have heard, for the first time is the first sitting president to ever visit a prison in this country. But I think we have to get him and his administration on board with the larger issues around funding the drug war in other countries. And I'm not sure that there's been enough focus and enough advocacy around that with him specifically, his administration, and with Congress specifically. Again, it has been an uphill battle to get their attention on this issue. And as I ended my remarks earlier, I noted that Congress, for example, is the last on board with this, the last to really recognize the reality of the problems of mass incarceration in this country. And that has been a multi-year, I won't call it a campaign, I'll just call it advocacy to help our legislators recognize that we have a real problem in this country. And so I think that same type of effort is going to be necessary for them to recognize and appreciate the seriousness of what is going on in other countries and how we are contributing to the war on drugs in other countries, a war that our president has acknowledged is a failure. Many lawmakers have acknowledged is a failure in this country, but so we need to make the connection that if we acknowledge it's a failure in this country, we cannot continue to fund it and support it in other countries. And I think that those points have been made, and I think that needs to be the parallel campaign to this.
I'd just like to add that, I think you pointed to a real problem, which is the disconnect between domestic and international drug control policy. Yeah. And, we have seen a slow but steady and important shift in domestic policy that has not yet caught up with international policy. Right. And I think for those of us working on the issue, what's particularly frustrating is, one, and I imagine this is similar to what you encounter at the domestic level, but there's a whole cadre of people within the U.S. bureaucracy that deals with international drug policy that's been there for a long time and is very wedded to present policies. And so trying to change those attitudes on the ground is extremely difficult. Yes. And the other thing is that as the Defense Department has increasingly taken over responsibilities that the State Department used to have, we're dealing with an institution that's much bigger, that has much less oversight, much less transparency. And that's a really big, Ethan Nadelman likes to refer to drug policy as this big ship, and it takes a long time to turn that cruise ship around, but it's sort of started moving in the other direction. Well, think of doing that with the Defense Department. It's particularly challenging. So, Mexico?
Okay, so that's basically a question I think we all ask ourselves every morning when we get up. How can we do things that actually have some impact and change the course of things? I think Mexico right now is in a very particular moment. It feels like things are bubbling under the surface. After Ayotzinapa, just the violence related to the drug war and how that has been exacerbated by the militarized security strategy, it's just part of everybody's common conversations every day now. So public opinion has started to change really quickly about the security strategy. And then just a series of different events on an international level are putting a lot of pressure on the government. From the Rapporteur on Torture's declaration about torture being generalized in Mexico, to all the coverage Ayotzinapa got, to the independent expert group from the Inter-American Commission's report that just came out, to the Inter-American Commission visit, to the hearings that happened yesterday, the Mexican government is receiving an international wave of criticism that I think what you can notice is that they're having to react to it. So we haven't been able to shake them enough to get what we want, which is justice, which is an end to this security strategy, which is a different approach to drug policy, but we are seeing them have to react. They're having to switch people in different institutions. They're having to constantly change their public opinion, to even have to discredit international bodies in order to say whatever they're saying isn't true. So they are having to react to something that is placing them in a really uncomfortable corner. So I think that kind of shows us that even though they don't care about national mobilization and they don't care about what happens on the inside, what happens on the outside creates a lot of pressure. So anything with international visibility is really able to move things around right now. Also because it just keeps climbing on top of this criticism that's just coming and coming and coming. So I think that that's one strategy, one place to go, one way to kind of push things.
Luciana?
Yeah.
No, just an addition to reflect, especially from Latin America, because now seems that we in Latin America are all Che Guevara's revolutionary of the drug policies, but really we need to take into account that our political elite has embraced prohibition and has implemented with very happy these policies of the drugs on the war on drugs, and that is related with the policies of mano dura and hard on and tough on crime, etc., that are functional to policies that are broader than that and has to be to criminalization of the poor sectors, etc., and incarceration as in the same way that is being used here in the US. So, of course, the drug laws that we have in force and the drug conventions, they are a problem. They present a problem to human rights, and they need to be reviewed. But we cannot think that the problem is focused there, and I think to come up with new strategies from civil society, we need to take into account that these strategies of the militarization of security related to drugs are broader than that. And the same militaries that are used to combat drugs, that are then 10 minutes after used to repress social protests or some other social problems that we have. So it is I think we have to have a very broad view in this.
I think that just something that in the U.S. it's very, well, I've heard it said a lot that the war on drugs has failed as a strategy, or at least it's something that Ethan Nadelman used in his TED Talk a few months ago. But I think that at least the Mexican and Latin American experience, and I think it probably applies to the U.S. as well, is that it hasn't really failed. It just has different objectives than those that are specifically placed on the table. So militarizing is very strategic when you need territorial control in order for transnational companies to occupy different territories where communities will not receive them. So there is somebody benefiting by all of this that is happening, and that's what we need to consider. It's not about showing them that they're wrong and that they will then be good-willed and changing, but we need to pressure them into not having a choice but change.
Thank you. Sergio, and then John, and then I think we need to wrap up, right? Yeah.
Okay. No, I just want to add that I think that it's very important that we join to the different victims of the war on drugs, because I think that if we, for example, show the stories of the more than of the families of the more than 76 people that, for example, has been killed, 76,000 people that has been killed in Colombia in the name of the war on drugs, or even the people that fighting this war on drugs also are victims of the war. For example, the more than 1,400 military that has been killed in Colombia in the last 15 years in the war on drugs, or the more than 1,600 police officers that has been killed in this war. We could join to the cause against this war, to people who are not on our side now, but we have to join all these kinds of victims and show the injustice that means these efforts that benefits some of the people, but a minority of the people of our countries in the Americas.
Thank you. John?
This is really a question for Jessalyn. You've emphasized that the reforms being debated now in the Congress are really just a first step towards undoing the damage we've done. And I think even so, symbolically, changes like that are extremely important. You've also said that, especially on the foreign policy side, the fact that the U.S. has exported a repressive model. What then are the arguments that seem to resonate most with especially conservative lawmakers that are now looking at this with new eyes?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I tell you, as we've seen both conservative and liberal groups come together, and conservative and liberal lawmakers come together over this issue of incarceration in this country, the reasons are different. The reasons, for example, that our conservative partners and conservative lawmakers have come to the table around this issue are fiscal with an F reasons. again, state budgets were devastated after the recession, and what they recognized as one of the largest line items in state budgets was prisons and the criminal justice system. And so that was the motivation for many conservative lawmakers and others to take a look at their systems and make reforms to them. And what they realized is they were incarcerating people who didn't need to be in jail. They were incarcerating people who had drug problems, alcohol problems. And if they could really spend less money to address those problems than the money that they spend, because it's very expensive to incarcerate people in this country, on incarcerating them, that they could get to resolve their fiscal problems that way. And then obviously the groups like the ACLU and other civil rights groups, we're concerned about the human cost of incarceration, the human cost to the person that's incarcerated, their families, their communities, and particularly when in a system like the federal system where you have long, harsh sentences where people for drug crimes are serving sentences 5, 10, 15, and they're mandatory sentences, though there's not a lot of flexibility that a judge has to sentence somebody under the 5, 10, 20, and sometimes life mandatory sentences. And so we see the human cost, but they also see the fiscal cost of those long sentences as well, and how much it costs to keep someone in prison for life for a non-violent, first-time offender drug sentence.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we need to wrap this up because there is another group that is chomping at the bit to get into this room. I would like to thank all of our speakers. And I would like to thank all of you for coming, and I would ask that we move out relatively quickly. We can kind of congregate out there to continue some of this discussion, but we need to let the other group get in the room. Thank you.